Okay, picture this. It's 17th century Europe, and there's this moral system floating around among some very smart people.
Hmm.
A system where maybe, just maybe, it's okay to kill someone, not for anything huge, but like for a slap, or just for bad-mouthing you.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a starting point.
Or, how about this? A judge takes money to rule unfairly, but it's fine because, well, technically, being unjust wasn't part of his job anyway.
That sounds incredibly cynical.
Eh?
Or maybe just incredibly legalistic.
Exactly. And underlying it all, this idea that the whole point of a religious system should be to stop people from despairing, even if that means, well, allowing some really flexible ethics.
Those examples are certainly striking. They really pull you into this intense and frankly sometimes quite bizarre controversy from the mid-1600s. It touched everything, religion, intellect, even politics.
Absolutely. So today we're diving deep into that period, a time when these arguments about, God's grace and human morality weren't just for theologians in dusty rooms.
No, they had real impact and sparked a huge public fight, kicked off dramatically by some anonymous letters.
Letters that sort of ripped the curtain back on these, well, startling ideas that had been maybe discussed more quietly before.
Exactly. And our guide for this is a historical text looking right at this period, especially those famous letters, the ones that drag these hidden arguments out into the open and just, boom, set off a firestorm.
Right. So our mission today, let's try and untangle this. Understand the core arguments about grace, about morality, explore some of these, genuinely shocking ideas being debated.
Shocking is a good word for some of them.
And see, what can we learn from this historical deep dive today? About dealing with complex systems, conflicting info, the whole messy business of right and wrong.
It's a fascinating look at how very abstract theological ideas can filter down into really surprising and sometimes pretty uncomfortable practical advice.
Okay, so at the heart of it all, there was this big theological clash, right?
Definitely. You had these groups, looking back to St. Augustine,
No.
the Jansenists, the Port Royal community, versus the Molinists, and the most prominent group there was the Jesuit order, a very powerful force.
Right. So the Jansenists, named after Cornelius Jansenist, they were arguing for a return to Augustine. Heavy focus on God's grace, human fallenness.
That's the core, yes. And Port Royal really embraced this. Very rigorous, austere, piety, learning, strict morals, which naturally put them at odds with the Jesuits on, well, quite a few things.
And the Jesuits, what was their angle? Founded by Ignatius Loyola, known for being dynamic, right? Education, missions.
Very active, very engaged with the world, and importantly, very loyal to the Pope. Their approach often seemed, let's say, more pragmatic, less rigid perhaps than some other groups.
Which led to clashes.
It did. A key battleground was the nature of grace, specifically this distinction between sufficient grace and efficacious grace.
Okay, break that down. Sufficient versus efficacious.
Well, both sides agreed. God offers sufficient grace enough for salvation. The argument was about what sufficient really meant. The Molinists, largely Jesuits, thought this grace was truly sufficient on its own. All it needed was human cooperation. Humans choose to accept it.
Okay.
But the Augustinian side, the Jansenists, argued no, you needed something more. An additional efficacious grace from God, something irresistible that guaranteed salvation when given.
So one side emphasizes human free will cooperating. The other emphasizes God's overwhelming, decisive grace.
That's a good way to put it. And this seemingly abstract point, it had huge downstream effects on how you understood free will, predestination, sin, the whole path to getting saved.
And this wasn't just debated quietly, it blew up publicly.
It did, especially when the Sorbonne, the theology faculty in Paris, condemned 5 propositions they said were from Jansenius' big book, Augustinus.
Okay, so they condemned these ideas. End of story.
Not quite, because the Jansenists played it cleverly. They said, okay, fine, those propositions in themselves are heretical. The Pope was right to condemn them.
But there's always a but.
The crucial bit. But, they said, those propositions aren't actually in Jansenius' book, or at least not in the heretical way you're reading them.
Which sounds like something you could just check. Open the book.
You'd think.
Yeah.
But then Pope Alexander VII stepped in, 1657, and he officially declared, yes, those 5 propositions are in Jansenius' book, and in the sense that was condemned.
Oof. Papal decree, that must have settled it.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The Jansenists pushed back again. They argued, okay, the Pope is infallible on matters of faith, doctrine, we accept that, but his authority doesn't necessarily cover matters of fact, like correctly identifying the content or meaning within a specific human book. They even brought up historical examples where they claimed popes had made factual errors.
Wow. So a fight over grace turns into a fight over papal authority and how you even interpret a text. That feels weirdly modern, like debates today about interpreting sources or spotting misinformation.
It absolutely resonates, doesn't it? Who gets to say what's true when you're looking at complex information? Whose interpretation holds sway?
But those anonymous letters we mentioned, they didn't just stick to these high-level debates, did they? They shifted gears dramatically.
They did. They pivoted to the practical side, to Jesuit moral theology, specifically something called casuistry. And that's where we get those really eye-popping examples you started with.
Casuistry, so like case studies for moral problems.
Essentially, yeah. The science, or maybe art, of resolving tough cases of conscience, helping confessors and people figure out what to do in morally gray areas. The Jesuits became really known for a system within casuistry called probabilism.
Probabilism. Okay, what did that entail?
The basic idea was this. If you had a moral dilemma, and there were different opinions on what was permissible, if even one reputable theologian, a grave doctor, supported a particular opinion, making it probable, then you're allowed to follow that probable opinion, even if the opposite, stricter opinion seemed more probable or safer to other people.
Wait, so if just one respected person somewhere argued for the less strict path, you could take it, even if most others disagreed. That sounds potentially problematic, like a race to the bottom, ethically speaking.
Critics definitely saw it that way, and they pointed out how it could be combined with another Jesuit concept, the direction of intention.
Direction of intention, what's that?
It suggested that the moral quality of an action could be changed, even excused, based on your inner intention. You could mentally redirect your aim away from the sinful aspect of the act towards some other non-sinful goal.
Okay, hang on. So, if the act itself seems wrong, like stealing, you could mentally say, my intention isn't really to steal, it's just to borrow this temporarily until I can give it back, and that makes it okay. Or less bad.
That's the kind of reasoning it allowed for, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe a simplified take, but it captures the essence.
Yeah.
And the source material gives some really wild examples of where this combination, probabilism plus direction of intention, could lead.
Like the killing someone for a slap example.
Exactly. One Jesuit author, Lessius, is cited saying that killing someone for a box on the ear might be permissible in speculation. Just thinking about it.
Okay, speculation.
But others apparently went further, arguing it was okay in practice, as long as, and this is key, as long as you manage to avoid certain inconveniences.
Inconveniences? Like what? Jail?
Like feeling hatred towards the person, or, yes, getting caught and punished by the state. The focus wasn't purely on the morality of killing, but on managing the consequences in your internal state.
That's quite a shift. And killing someone for slander. That also came up.
Yes. The source mentions authors who argued it was lawful to kill a slanderer if there was absolutely no other way to stop them ruining your reputation. Again, the justification pivots from the inherent value of life to protecting one's honor.
Wow. It wasn't just violence, though, right? What about things like charity?
Oh, the discussions on almsgiving are also pretty staggering. The author Vasquez is quoted basically saying that giving your superfluity anything you don't strictly need of the poor is almost never required in practice.
Almost never. But isn't charity a core principle? Why wasn't it required?
Because, according to Vasquez's reasoning, pretty much anything you have could be considered necessary. For yourself, for your relative, even just for maintaining your social standing, your condition. So those things couldn't be called superfluity, meaning you rarely, if ever, actually had any superfluity to give away.
That basically redefines charity out of existence for anyone well off.
It certainly seems to minimize the obligation drastically. Vasquez apparently went even further, suggesting a rich person isn't truly obliged to give charity unless the poor person is in such extreme need that they be morally justified in robbing the rich person first.
That turns the whole idea on its head. The obligation shifts from the giver to the desperation of the receiver.
It's a very striking piece of reasoning.
And the judges taking money for injustice. How did they justify that?
The source points to authors who drew this distinction. A judge can't take money to provide justice because justice is something he owes, it's his duty.
Okay, that makes sense.
But, they argued, he could potentially take money to provide injustice. Why? Because delivering injustice isn't his duty, it's not something he owes anyone. So accepting payment for it wasn't seen as corruptly selling his duty.
That is just staggering logic. It's like finding a loophole in the very definition of corruption.
It's a prime example of how this kind of hyper-legalistic reasoning could critics argued, completely bypass core moral intuitions.
It really makes you ask, how did they even arrive at these conclusions? Was it purely about guiding conscience in tricky cases, or was there maybe another motive, like making religion easier?
The sources definitely suggest a strong push towards accommodation, towards making things more palatable. Critics pointed to techniques in confession, for example.
Like what?
Like using a general confession, sort of vaguely confessing everything in your whole life as a way to avoid having to confess specific, recent, maybe embarrassing sins.
And what about actually being, repentant?
That was another area.
Mm-hmm.
The source mentions arguments that confessors basically had to grant absolution even if they suspected the person wasn't genuinely planning to change their ways.
Really? On what grounds?
As long as the person expressed some kind of sorrow, even if it was just attrition.
Attrition? What's that?
It means sorrow based purely on fear of punishment, like fear of hell. Not sorrow based on love for God or sorrow for having done wrong. Just fear.
So being scared of getting caught is enough. You don't actually have to feel bad about the act itself. That seems like a really low bar for forgiveness.
It certainly struck critics as worryingly low. And then there was the debate about avoiding proximate occasions of sin.
Situations where people that might lead you to sin again.
Exactly. Some casuists argued you weren't strictly obliged to avoid those situations if doing so would cause you major inconvenience. Or, get this, if it would make you look weird or out of step with society.
So social awkwardness or personal convenience could outweigh avoiding something you know is likely to make you sin.
According to some of these authors, yes. It paints a picture, doesn't it? And one Jesuit author is quoted, summing up their big project. Never to repulse anyone, and so avoid driving people to despair.
Wow. That quote kind of says it all, doesn't it? The ultimate goal. Maximum accommodation. Maybe, as critics saw it, sacrificing strict moral standards to make sure everyone felt included, absolved, and not lost.
From one angle, maybe that sounds compassionate, pastorally speaking.
Yeah.
But from the stricter viewpoint, the Augustinian or Jansenist view, it looked incredibly dangerous, like watering down the faith itself.
And that is precisely what Blaise Pascal jumped on with his famous Provincial letters. He didn't just argue, he ridiculed.
Exactly, Pascal. Brilliant mind mathematician, physicist, theologian, connected with Port Royal. He took these often obscure moral maxims buried in huge Latin volumes by Jesuit casuists like Escobar, Sanchez, Lessius, and he dragged them into the light, put them before the Parisian public in these incredibly witty, sharp, satirical letters, and crucially, very readable letters.
Weren't they anonymous at first? Framed like a conversation?
Yes. Like a curious guy in Paris talking to a Sorbonne theologian about the initial disputes, and then later talking to a Jesuit father who supposedly reveals all these secrets of their moral theology. The dialogue format, the irony, it was devastatingly effective.
And people actually read them.
They were a sensation. Immediately popular. Copied, passed around, discussed everywhere. Suddenly, people across Europe were laughing at the Jesuits and these doctrines.
So Pascal's genius wasn't just finding the quotes, but how he presented them.
Absolutely. The source confirms he quoted accurately. Apparently, the Jesuits themselves later had to condemn many of these same maxims once Pascal put them under the spotlight. But his real skill was using brilliant ridicule to show how absurd, how inconsistent these ideas could be.
He argued some things deserved mockery, right? Like justifying murder for silly reasons, or this idea he pinned on them about being saved without ever actually loving God.
Yes, he called that idea the climax of impiety. He drew on early church writers like Tertullian, who said some errors are so foolish they deserve only to be laughed at. Pascal saw these maxims as genuinely undermining morality itself.
And he defended using humor.
Fiercely. He argued that sometimes the most charitable thing you can do is expose error through ridicule so people see its folly and reject it.
I can imagine the Jesuits weren't exactly thrilled.
Furious is probably an understatement. They tried everything, accused him of misquoting, of being profane, of being a Jansenist extremist trying to tear down the church. But their lengthy, technical, theological replies often couldn't compete with Pascal's sharp wit and the sheer shock value of the maxims themselves.
So this whole battle played out in public using the printing press.
Very much so. It's a great example of the power of print and public opinion. The source even notes that when the Pope eventually condemned Pascal's letters, it didn't really stop them. They had taken such deep root in people's minds as to bid defiance to all these powers.
It really shows how hard it is for big institutions to control the story once it gets out there and captures the public imagination.
And it highlights that tension within institutions, too. The Jesuit society had this structure where the whole order was kind of collectively responsible for what its members wrote.
So one controversial author reflected on everyone.
To some extent, yes. And the source suggests their initial reaction seemed more focused on defending their authors, defending the glory of the society, rather than immediately disavowing the really questionable stuff.
This whole saga, wow, from abstract grace debates to truly shocking moral advice, and then this public showdown driven by satire, it's quite a journey.
It paints a vivid picture, doesn't it? The challenges of navigating ethics, integrity within these large, complex systems. It offers a historical lens on struggles that feel very current.
Okay, so let's recap where we've been. We've journeyed through this really intricate world of 17th century religious arguments. We saw the clash between theological schools.
So Jansenists and Port Royal versus the Jesuits.
Explored those specific arguments about sufficient versus efficacious grace.
And then we plunged into the sometimes astonishing flexibility, maybe elasticity is the word of Jesuit casuistry, on sin, justice, even killing someone.
Yeah. We've definitely seen how intense these doctrinal fights could be and how these, seemingly abstract ideas about theology had very real, sometimes quite disturbing implications for everyday life and morality.
And the role of institutions comes through so clearly, both the power and the potential pitfalls. You see it in the Jesuit organization dealing with the fallout from these writings, and you see it in the church hierarchy trying to manage this massive public controversy.
And you absolutely cannot forget the power of Pascal's wit. That sharp writing, the public exposure, it had such a potent impact.
It really did. And at its heart, maybe this whole story is about that constant human struggle, right? Trying to square strict rules and high ideals with the messy reality of how people actually behave.
So, thinking about you listening, how do these debates we've talked about land today? When you hear about direction of intention, justifying an act, or finding loopholes in obligations, or debating how much regret is enough, does that echo how we sometimes justify our own actions, or how we judge others?
Yeah, and how do you navigate complex rules or conflicting views within the systems you're part of?
Yeah.
Your workplace, your community, whatever it is. What does it even mean to be truly well-informed when information is complex and even the supposed experts or authorities disagree so vehemently?
And here's a final thought to chew on, something that really stands out from this history, that core tension. On one side, you have this drive for rigorous principles, sticking to the rules no matter what, like the Augustinians, Port Royal.
Hold the line, high standards.
Right. And on the other side, this desire to accommodate, to make things work for everyone, maybe bend the rules so you don't drive people to despair, the impulse behind some of that Jesuit casuistry.
The lenient approach versus the strict approach.
Exactly. How do you see those two approaches playing out in the world around you? In systems you encounter, relationships, even your own moral compass? What are the costs and what are the benefits of leaning one way or the other?